we're going to talk about the icon and abstraction, how icons manifest and veil the invisible. So first of all, what are icons? Because the word icon has been bandied around a lot. I pushed the wrong button. Yeah. So it's better to describe what I'm talking about the icon tradition. Does anyone know what the word icon means, where it comes from? Image, that's right, yeah. So obviously, Andy Warhol makes images. A photograph is an image. So when I'm talking about icons, I'm talking about the tradition of liturgical art, both East and West, up to about, I'd say, 13th century. Romanesque work, for example, is a wonderful example of Western iconography. For various reasons we can discuss later, things began to change in Western liturgical art. So I would say up to about the 13th, 14th century, Western church art can be classed as an icon. And then that tradition continued in the East until today. So that's what I'm talking about, liturgical art. And not just the panel icon, carving, as I've been saying earlier, it could refer to mosaic, to embroidery, basically anything that's used in the worship of the church. Why are we talking about icons today in the West? Icons have been forgotten more or less until, I would say, the beginning of the 20th century, when a number of things happened. The Russian icons had either been overpainted with more up-to-date, inverted commas, paintings, so we didn't really know what the originals were like, or the varnish got darkened. But in the early 20th century, a lot of these icons were clean with modern technology. They could strip the overpainting off. So there's this revelation of these amazing icons and all their brightness. And this actually began to affect art in the West. Matisse, who'd already become established in his painting, was invited to see these newly restored icons or newly cleaned icons. And a lot was written about his response. And he said, these confirm that I'm on the right track. As we'll discuss in a minute, it affected a lot of early modernist movements, abstract art movements, but I'll go into detail. So that's why, one reason why icons are now talked about in the West. The cleaning of these icons, Russian emigres. There's a Greek man, Fotis Kontoglou, who studied art, secular art in Paris. Then he revived more traditional icon painting styles in Greece, and he wrote about it. So a lot happened in the early 20th century to reintroduce icons to the West. So the three things I want to mention about what icons do before we get into, as it were, the style of icons. The first thing to remember is that icons do a job. They do these are examples, so I forgot that one. So these are some of the early cleaned icons, and you can see the brightness of the colours and the flatness. And you can see Matisse here, very similar, sort of flat areas, not trying to, like a Renaissance painting, produce depth. So you can see why he was so excited seeing icons like that. In fact, there was a man called Roger Fry. He was one of the great art critics promoting modernism. I'm talking about early modernism, the abstract movement, and people like Matisse. He called the work of Matisse and others as Neo-Byzantine because he saw the correlation, the flatness of it, the strong colours and various other things. Okay, so the three elements to have in mind about icons. Firstly, they're liturgical. Does anyone know what the word liturgy comes from, what it means literally? Work for the people, that's right. So one early use of it was the people in Rome coming together to basically, like a house of parliament, to do work together. So it means work. I lived in Greece and learned modern Greek, and you would hear things like "Aptotokineto then liturgy." It doesn't liturgize. My car doesn't liturgize. My car doesn't work. So it's wonderful hearing these words in the original context. So icons aren't there just to sort of look at and write articles about. You can see they're processed here. Here they're kissed. We greet the saint by kissing them. It's not idolatry, we're just saying hello to the saint. You'll notice that most icons exhibited will be a bit battered around the bottom. You might see some burn marks on them. That's because they've been loved to death, as it were. They're used. So that's really important. They have a function. And I would suggest that one of the reasons there's a crisis in modern art, it doesn't have a function anymore. In a way, each art critic's got to create a function for every icon, every painting or every work of art. Whereas with liturgical art, you have a drama, as it were, and an icon painter, an icon carver is like a maker, designer, a stage set. See what I'm getting at? Someone comes with this play that's ready made, and I've got to make a stage set for it. So an icon is not that different from that. You've got the church's liturgy, which is not just the invention of humans, it's divinely revealed through humans, and the icon is part of that. That's the first thing. We tend to think of art now as me and the artwork, me and the object, two things. An icon's got to be understood as a mediator between heaven and earth. Always think of three. If there's something you don't understand about the icon tradition, always think of three. What are the three? So us, the praying viewer, the image, that's like a door. It's not an object in its own right. It's there to lead us through to the saint. So you've got to understand that in the liturgy, the saints are present, the angels are present, Christ is present. So, and I noticed Brendan used the term represent. There are two ways of understanding represent. These people aren't with us now, so the painting represents them. I can also use that word represent. If that's St. Cuthbert. St. Cuthbert, through Christ, is part of the one church. So when I'm in a church service, I'm not starting at service, I'm joining in the ceaseless worship of heaven with all the saints around. I can't explain how it happens, but in Christ, everyone's present. It says this in the book of Hebrews, of course, that becomes an innumerable host of angels. And it's interesting that in that verse in Hebrews, Christ is mentioned at the end. It says, you've come to the innumerable host of heavens, to the spirits of those made just, and to Jesus. So we can't come to Jesus, just me and my Jesus. We come to the whole communion of the saints. I remember as an Anglican, saying that Apostles' Creed, I believe in the fellowship of the saints. And I used to think, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could experience that? But it was just an idea. That it wasn't until I started worshipping in a church with icons all around, it became real. I realized actually, the saints say, come and join us for an hour or two. The service finishes and I leave and they say, see you later, we'll stay here. That's the sort of feeling. So the icon mediates that. So this icon here is called the protecting veil. It's of an actual miracle. Constantinople was under attack, so people were in Hagia Sophia for protection. And there's a fall for Christ here, and he had a vision of the Mother of God protecting the city. But it just happens that the commemoration of that feast overlaps with Saint Methodius the Melodist, who was a hymnographer. So in fact, you've got two feasts overlapping. But I choose this because here you've got people on earth, you've got various bishops and monks and that, but above here you've got heavenly people, they've got angels, they've got halos, but they're all together in the same service. Those on earth and those in heaven are in the same service, as it were. So you can imagine the icon exists in this mediating realm between those in the church physical and those in the church spiritual. There aren't two churches, one in heaven, one on earth. Is one church, it's one body of Christ. So think of the icon as a mediator. We came in through this door here. Did you stand looking at the door? No. You walked through it and then you forgot about the door. So that's why I don't sign any icons. I'm just a door maker, then I disappear. I don't want people to just be looking at my icons. I want them to look through the icon and meet the saint. Then I'm happy. In other words, it's a mediator that has a function beyond itself. So the icon works. It has a liturgical function. It mediates. And it transforms. It transforms the way we see. And this is primarily to do with the way icons are painted. So here we have a painting I've done of Moses. And he sees the bush that's burning without being consumed. Tell me, why do you think it's important that the bush wasn't consumed? What does that tell you about the nature of the fire?
Supernatural.
Supernatural, otherwise it would have burnt the bush up. Now, I think that it wasn't as though that bush suddenly started burning and Moses saw it, and then when Moses went, the bush stopped burning. It had always been burning. In other words, and this is our teaching of I think East and West Christendom, but certainly emphasized a lot in Eastern Christendom, but it's also in the book of Hebrews, that God created everything with a logos. Christ, the logos, capital L, speaks the word, like oak tree. And the oak tree comes into existence, but that word, that logos, small l, that God spoke, remains in that tree and keeps it in existence. So in the book of Hebrews, it says that he upholds all things by the word of his power. He doesn't just create all things, but he upholds all things by the word of his power. And that Greek word for word is not logos, it's rhema. Does anyone know what the Greek word rhema means? What sort of word? It means the spoken word. Okay? So God is actively speaking through that thing. And each thing has its own unique word. A stone, a person, a tree, they all have a unique logos. So basically, what really changes is not the tree, but God opened Moses' eyes to see that bush as it always was. I can see each of you in two ways, either just as bodies or as living images of God. And I bow down and I honor you because you are princes and princesses. So how I see you depends on my own state of soul, not so much on you. And I've known some saints in my life, three of them have been canonized. And it always go away feeling changed. And it's primarily because they were so thirsty for God, they could look at a sinner like me and not be bothered about the 99% rubbish, but just be so thirsting for that 1% that remained in the image of God in me. And that's what they were talking to. So I went away feeling that they'd been addressing me as I was a prince. So I was changed by the way they saw me. You meet some people and they're always judging you and making you feel horrible about yourself. So I'm affected by the way people see me, for better or for worse. And it's the same for all of us. So the way that an icon is painted, this is obviously not like a photographic thing, is it? The way we've done the garments, they do follow certain laws. But on the other hand, it's what we call transfigured. And we're going to talk about this later. So it's not so much a mental thing, thinking that represents that, that represents that. It's living with icons for over the years. It begins to transform the way you see. So you're looking for the fire, not just for the bush. You're looking at the invisible reality as well as the visible. And I can't explain how it happens, but it's just by osmosis, basically. Okay, so that's sort of the main characteristics of the icon, which explain a lot of the things we'll be talking about its outer form. And this is something that's been intuited by a lot of people. Samuel Palmer. So could someone read this? The fun here in ancient times.
In ancient times, men saw God everywhere. The sun was a burning witness. The moon was a mystic lamp. The stars sang together, and all the winds were the breathings of his mouth.
Thank you. Does anyone know the work of Samuel Palmer? Hands up. Terrible.
Even the sick was low with the English printmaker.
Yeah, he lived in the 19th century. He was you must look him up. He's known for sort of sepia paintings. Just a remarkable man. But yeah, he's sort of contemporary with William Blake, I think. Yeah, in that sort of period. Yeah. So William Blake. Would you like to read William Blake?
To see a world in a grade of sand, and a heaven in a wildflower, golden lily in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour.
Okay, so this sense of perceiving the logoi within things is common through all great civilizations. We can talk a lot about that, but that's something that's not just only known in the icon tradition. It's an intuition that's been known by many. Right. So I'm talking here about the liturgical art, the icon. That is not the only form of art, of course, is it? So I've got this idea that there's gallery art, in other words, art that people paint not for liturgy, but for whatever, selling, exhibiting. And there is overlap. I'll show you how the icon had a profound influence in early gallery art of the 20th century, for example. I think there is demonic art. There is some art that just drags you down. I mean, Francis Bacon is a great painter, but you look at his work and you feel he's sort of smudging humanity. So he uses his artistic gift not to raise us, but to drag us down. And then there's mediocre work, but also there's what I call threshold art, like Rembrandt, Matisse. These are people who aren't doing liturgical art, but it's as though they intuit something about something that's divine, something that's heavenly. Even if I don't think of it as heavenly, like Monet, who was so interested in light, of course, the way light interacts with form. Light, of course, is an image, an icon of God. So even if the conscious objective of one's painting isn't religious, that comes out anyway with some of this threshold art. It's sort of half in, half out the church. So there are different types of gallery art, but it's important that we distinguish them but don't separate them. So what I want to talk now about is some of the metaphysical underpinning of the icon and how this is the opposite of what's become accepted about great art more recently. I don't want to be negative, but I think these are positive to what I'm saying. So a positive thing is that a lot of the early great modernists actually came from Orthodox countries and were inspired by that whole ethos. So Constantin Brancusi, he was the founder of modern abstract sculpture. He was from Romania, and he was talking to a friend of his, Petre de Pandia, and Petre was saying how wonderful his work was. And Brancusi said, well, my studio in Paris, he was raised in Romania, but walked all the way to Paris, is actually just an outpost of his monastery. So for him, what he was doing was influenced by his life. He didn't become a monk, but his life visiting the monastery. He was actually a very good chanter in the Orthodox Church, and the church funded his study of art in Romania. And when he came to Paris, he was very poor, and he made some income by being a psalmist, a singer in Orthodox services. So he was immersed in the theology of the Orthodox Church, probably through his chanting. So he was influenced by Buddhism as well and other things, but you can see in his sayings, his aphorisms, it's a close connection between Orthodox mystical theology and what he was aiming to do. So you can see here, just also physically, he was influenced by Romanian work. This is his famous Endless Column, and this is a long tradition in Romania. A Romanian friend said that I think the number of sort of nodules relates to the age they died or something like that. So there was this tradition which he drew inspiration from. Vasily Kandinsky, also from Russia, he was the founder of modern abstract painting. He drew a lot of his ideas, but also early on a lot of his schema from icons. Can you see the relationship there? Let me see. But also the flattening, that's definitely influenced by icons. We'll talk earlier about how the icon deliberately makes itself imperfect. It compresses itself, not trying to recreate three-dimensional form. So that influenced him as well. And he describes visiting fresco churches in Russia and how he was so impressed by the fact that you're completely enveloped in the colour. I don't know if you've ever been to a fresco church, but I'll show you a photograph of a chapel. I lived as a hermit for 7 years, and I frescoed a chapel I converted. And you walk in and you're completely surrounded by the saints and embraced in colour. And that we know that had a big effect on Kandinsky from this experience of churches in Russia. You can see here another example of a direct influence. Igor Stravinsky, you could say that he's one of the early inventors of abstract composition. He was Russian, and he became a very devout member for the last 30 years of his life. Rather surprisingly, Andy Warhol. Could you read this by John Richardson about Warhol?
He did have a secret, one that he kept dark from all of his closest friends. He was exceedingly devout, so much so that he made daily visits to the Church of St. Vincent Barrier on the Upper East Side of Manhattan.
That's there, yeah. Especially after there was an attempt on his life. But every day pop isn't there. His mother was a very devout Byzantine Catholic, and I was Roman Catholic, but using the Byzantine tradition, therefore, with icons. He was raised with icons around. So whenever you think of his work, he basically did icons of a consumer society, didn't he? That was his thing. So he was influenced, one way or the other, by the whole icon tradition. So what I'm trying to say is that icons aren't just an isolated little phenomenon. They're common to us liturgically in the West for 1,300 years, and they had an influence in a lot of early modern art. So now we're going to look at common notions of art, I would say art particularly the last 70, 80 years, and how the truth has challenged by the metaphysics of the icon. So I'm going to start each page with, in italics, a thing that most people take for granted now, and then I'm going to say how the icon tradition responds to that. So originality means to be novel. That's what most people think, isn't it? We say, oh, it's original, means that it's not like anything else. But in fact, the original meaning of originality is to go to the origin of things. Okay? So here I've got 3 examples of the same icon theme, but they're all different. So they're similar but different, aren't they? And the difference comes from the fact that you're trying to indicate the infinite. All right? So instead of trying to be different, 3 different people are painting icon of Christ, but because Christ is God as well as man, then each of them brings out a different element, as it were. It's a bit like light, like some might emphasize different wavelengths of the light. Same light, but different emphasis. This is a Georgian one, this is a Russian one, and this is an English one. So instead of originality being defined by novelty, it's defined more by, have I captured the essence? Have I gone to the origin, the core of something? And of course, if all of us here were equally good painters, portrait painters, and we all painted the same person, we'd all be a bit different, wouldn't we? So originality comes naturally out of trying to honour the person we're painting, not because you decide to be bizarre and different. Realism is equivalent to naturalism. No. So let's look at these 2 depictions of the same event. Okay, you've got this one here. Both of them depict Christ being taken from the cross and laid out in the tomb. Okay, tell me, which do you think is closest to the original meaning of this God-man dead? And this is a personal question, I don't care what you answer, just I'm interested in an honest answer. Which of those do you think is more realistic in the sense of closer to reality? Yep.
Well, the one on the right you have a platted plane, and that would suggest the idea that suggests Jesus is interfaced with heaven and earth at the same time, which seems a little bit more, Whereas on the left seems to be saying those 2 realms are divorced. I can't see what especially what's going on in the Giotino painting.
That's very good. And what makes you think that this indicates heaven and earth? What about this that indicates, well, that's obviously earthly, the dead body. What suggests the heavenly aspect to that?
Well, I see also these are spiritual beings because of the wing.
That's right, yeah.
But it's the flag of planes that suggest in the same space.
Right, exactly. So basically this is more real. That's more naturalistic, but it's less real than that in the sense that it doesn't, as it will indicate the fire. This one indicates the bush, but not the fire. This has got the bush and the fire. Okay. And you find this in icons, that they use paradox, the delight in paradox. I mean, this man, if Christ appeared now, this man, a bit shorter than me probably, just a body, and you say this man is God, that freaks you out, doesn't it? But that's the case. It's a paradox. You can't comprehend that in your brain, that Jesus Christ who worked on earth was the creator of heaven and earth. It's true. It's a paradox, but it's true. So in icons, always you're bringing together in the same frame, as you correctly said, heaven and earth. All sorts of funny things. So often in the crucifix, icons of the crucifix, you have a sign above, and it doesn't say Jesus, King of the Jews. It says something else. Can anyone tell me what is often put up on that sign? What words? The King of Glory. The King. This man, bloody on the cross, dying. King of Glory, come on. But he is. That's where he came from. So all the time you're thrown into, you're discombobulated with icons. And it's not the sort of playing games with your emotion, that's reality. So this explains the abstract element of icons, because you're indicating, suggesting, not depicting, but suggesting the invisible as well as the visible. Abstractionism is departure from reality. Does anyone know what the word abstract means, literally?
You take.
Exactly, yeah. So in academia, what's an abstract? How would you define an abstract in academia? What does an abstract do?
which is just the essence of it.
Exactly, yeah. So you wouldn't say that the abstract is a departure from the bigger paper. It's capturing the essence of it, isn't it? It compresses it, it leaves things out, but it's got the essence. So, and the early abstractionists of the 20th century said just that. We think now of abstract art as something that's completely unrelated to reality. But no, Brancusi said they're imbeciles, is the translation, who call my work abstract. He said, what I give you is the reality of things. In other words, real abstraction is giving you the core of things. Okay. Kandinsky, the same. He wrote The Spiritual in Art. He was explaining his abstraction as to use his words. I'd say in stress and Gerard Manley Hopkins is the equivalent, the inner core, the logos, if you like. So let's look at this mosaic here. This is in Ravenna, Santa Apollinarian class. This is actually the Transfiguration. You wouldn't think of it, would you? This is the Transfiguration. What things do you think hint that it depicts the Transfiguration? It's a difficult question, but who do you think these might be?
Moses and Elijah.
Moses and Elijah, exactly. How many people were with Christ apart from Moses and Elijah? Three. Peter, James, and John. So they're depicted as sheep. What was Christ talking about with Moses and Elijah? It says in the Bible they were talking about his coming glory, his crucifixion. They're talking about his coming crucifixion, which is his glory. Hence, this bejeweled cross here. So there's so much you can say about this, but I've written a whole article on my website. If you go to it under articles, I've written about this mosaic. So basically, it tells us so much more about the Transfiguration than just Jesus with 2 people there and 3 people down the bottom. Basically, it's saying that when Christ was transfigured, he was showing us, and this is a quote from an Orthodox hymn, when you were transfigured, O Christ, you showed us the original glory of man arrayed in the divine glory. So some of the fathers say that before the fall, we were clothed with light. And when we fell from God, as it were, if I were to pull the plug out, we'd have no light, would we? So when we fell, we lost that garment of light. But what Christ does, he takes on this unlighting garment of our humanity, and he sticks the plug back in, and it reunites it to divinity and makes it shine. So the Transfiguration, this icon says, is not an isolated miracle. It's actually returned to how God intended us to be, which is to be bearers of light, bearers of the Holy Spirit, bearers of uncreated light. So Christ is tiny there. He's just his head there. But St. Apollinarius is bigger. That's because Christ came not to aggrandize himself, but to make us great, to make us radiant. And then down the bottom here, you have other bishops. And down below here, you've got the altar. And that's where we would be if we were in that church. So in other words, Christ becomes small through the bishop, through the apostolic succession, through Holy Communion, and we become transfigured. And not just us, but the whole of creation. You see there's a little bit of a halo around even the trees and the rocks. So even they participate and are transfigured through Christ. So when Christ took on our humanity, he actually wrapped the whole of the cosmos around himself, the sun and the moon, the earth and the trees, everything that had been dullened by our rejection of God. He picked it up off the ground. As my daughter's very messy. She saw living clothing lying around. Clothing is meant to be worn, not just trampled on. So God takes our humanity, which we've trampled on, wraps it around himself, and he wraps the whole of the cosmos around himself, and he makes it transfigured. So here, this abstracted image tells us a lot more than just a picture of a man Jesus with 5 people hanging around. Okay? So here's some examples of how other icons use abstraction. Icons are flattened. Why do you think they're flattened? Why don't we sort of have things like, if this is a photograph, the rock would be really big and Mary would be really small, but we flatten things. Why do we flatten things?
Is it related to the doorway analogy?
Yeah. Could you draw that out a bit? Why would it help it to be more like a door?
I suppose if there was a sense of visual depth to the image, you might could draw into the image.
Yeah.
So if you have a flattened frame, then you're drawn to the image but beyond it.
Exactly, yeah. So it's a deliberate weakness in icons because it's not the centre of attention. It actually has a built-in, what's the term? Redundancy. Yeah, good. What else? What freedom do you have if you're not having to bother too much about depth? So I call it tipping. You tip everything up. What other freedoms would it give you that you wouldn't have if you had to have everything in the depth perspective?
Yeah, it's like the Greek one, you can represent multiple realities at the same time.
Yeah.
You're not forced into conventions of reading a picture.
Exactly, yeah. So again, you can abstract things to bring out truth. So how many times is Jesus depicted here? That's obviously him there. Where else is he depicted? He's being washed. Yeah, exactly. So he's depicted twice. So we're playing not only with spatial perspective, but also temporal perspective. So he's being washed here to prove that he actually became a real human being. Because there's one heresy that said that God couldn't possibly become a real human being because God doesn't like matter. He just pretended to be human. So this counters that heresy, saying, no, he became man like us, of a body that had to be washed. So we're making a theological statement, and we only have that freedom because we can have Christ shown twice, and we can do that because everything's flattened. In this particular icon, well, can you tell me, how have I composed this icon? How many bands are there? How many sort of tears do you see? And what do they each represent?
4 or 5.
4 or 5? So what's the top one?
The heavenly realm.
Okay, yep. So you've got the star and the angels. What's the next one down? Basically that though, isn't there? That's sort of, okay. And then the bottom there. So what's happening at the bottom? His body's being washed. I'll give you a clue. This is Joseph doubting the virgin birth. This here, there'll be different interpretations, but I believe the correct one is Isaiah. He's got this budding branch. Does anyone know what Isaiah prophesied about becoming of?
The root and branch of Jesse.
Yep, that's one. So that's why it was kept in the Ark of the Covenant as a sort of promise of the virgin birth, basically. But also said, a virgin shall conceive and bear a child, and his name shall be called Emmanuel, which means, what does Emmanuel mean? God with us. Okay. So virgin, in other words, is going to blood forth miraculously. So this is sort of the human element, a baby being washed and doubt. Here, who are these on the left and who are these on the right? For God. Yeah. So these are Jews and these are Gentiles. They are rich and learned. These are professors. This is Brendan here, professor. Probably not rich, but a professor. And this is me. I'm just a peasant from New Zealand. But they walk together in Christ, Jew and Gentile, rich and poor, learned, unlearned. So this is the mediating level. So Christ is right in the center here. He's God and man. But it happens through the Mother of God, and she's partially horizontal through the incarnation. These people are united to these, but she's also partially vertical. God is united to man. So none of that you'd be able to do if you had to have it in 3D. Okay. And every icon has got some play like that. Here, what do you notice about how the facial, this is Mary Magdalene. I painted that for the whole bust for Magdalen College it was in Oxford. So what's different about these features here? If it were a photograph, how does it differ from a photograph? Look at the eyes. Are the eyes normal? Elongated. Why do you think it's elongated? Yeah. So, saints and holiness make us more human in one way, but also deify us, so we're more than just mere human, yeah. And it's interesting, when I was a sculptor, I noticed a common feature in traditional religious art, be it African, Egyptian, it tended to be a strong vertical line. So in an icon, often we narrow the nose. It might even be elongate, but certainly narrow it to create that vertical line. Okay. What about the eyes, the size of the eyes? They normal? They're bigger, aren't they? So why do you think they're made bigger? Yeah. The word repent in Greek is interesting. Metanoia means metanous. And nous is best defined as the eye of the heart. I very much believe that right action comes from right seeing. Wrong action comes from wrong seeing. So if I'm mistreating someone, it's because I don't see them as they really are. I don't treat them as a living image of God. But if I treat you all as living images of God, I'm going to treat you differently. So the saint is the same because they see the logoi in creation. They see the whole creation, including people, as theophanic, as a manifestation, a revelation of God. So we treat it with great respect. I think our ecological disaster is not primarily a technical one. It's because we don't see the world as theophany. We see it as a big bank of endless amounts of money we can draw on at will. So the most efficient way of solving the ecological crisis is to change the way we see. There's no doubt about it. Very efficient. It can happen in a second. Then we wouldn't consume so much because we're more content. We would cut down a tree if we need to build a house, but we're not just going to cut down lots of trees because we want, lots of things we don't need. It'll change the way that we relate to the whole cosmos. Good. Tradition and skill stifle creativity. So many times I meet people who've studied art at art school, even the top art schools, and they tell us they refuse to teach us any technique. I say, can we have a life course? Oh, no, it'll restrict your creativity. We're here just to let you create freely. But how ridiculous. A composer of music, they've got to know the theory of music and all these things, then they can make something new. But it's a very common thought nowadays, a heretical thought, that tradition and skill stifle creativity. So you think of scientific discoveries, and same with academia, isn't it? Like if you're writing about something, you read the literature on that period, don't you? Then you add your bit. You don't sort of drop down from heaven and just write something out of nothing. You make something new out of something that exists. So Einstein, brilliant genius, of course, but I've been reading about the theory of relativity and quantum theory. And all these breakthroughs happened by seeing the pattern in existing discoveries and then, as it were, creating a formula that joined them all together. So everything that Einstein came up with was actually just sort of the next step on the long journey. Does anyone know what the word tradition means? Traditio is the Latin. Traditio. Handing on. To hand on. Same with the Greek, paradosi. Para over dosi, to give. So tradition is to hand something on. If I want to learn, how to play the flute, I humble myself before a skilled flute player, and then I receive the tradition that they've been taught by another person. So that submitting myself to their tradition doesn't restrict me, of course, does it? It opens doors for me. So this is a heresy of a lot of modernity, this whole idea of originality being doing something novel. Therefore, tradition is a threat to my originality in that case, isn't it? But if the opposite is I'm wanting to get to the core of things, I need help to do that. So I'm going to learn from the tradition. So this man here is a great iconographer, Theophan the Greek. As the name suggests, he came from Greece, but he gradually moved over toward Russia. I think he realized that Greece, Byzantium, was on its last legs. And really prolific. He painted 40 churches in his lifetime, frescoed 40 churches. Now, he did this so he could do really detailed work, but he also did that. You can't do that unless you can do that. One of my favorite sayings of Brancusi was, simplicity is complexity resolved. Simplicity is complexity resolved. You can't do the simple properly unless you know the complexity. So unless you're skilled, you can't simplify. I'm interested in Chinese painting. I'm reading a fantastic book at the moment on traditional Chinese painting, and they have levels of excellence. At the bottom is being highly skilled. at the top is having the skill and dispensing with it because you're like a prophet trying to communicate the Tao of something, the inner essence. But you've got to have the skill. When they say it's the bottom, others saying, so you've got to have skill to be able to dispense with it. Picasso could do his abstracted works because he could paint really realistically. You can't jump the gun. Okay. So this is a recent icon. It's almost that big that I was commissioned. A completely new design, really to bring together spiritual Orthodox doctrine with scientific discoveries. So you've got the different days of creation. So you've got a horizontal element of evolution development. This is the Garden of Paradise here, and these are the different creatures in the order that they appear in the fossil record. But also you've got the vertical element that we start with the beginning and we go through to the New Jerusalem. So this is Genesis and this is the New Jerusalem. So a new icon, but on the other hand, it's sort of drawing on the tradition. There's an existing icon in Russia that had a similar sort of shape, and I got the idea from that. And so basically you've got a square here, topped by a dome. What do you think the dome represents, and what does the square represent? The square is 4 elements. So what do you think the square represents? Earth, exactly. The 4 corners of the earth, 4 elements, etc. What do you think the dome represents? Heaven, exactly. So you can't understand the world without understanding God, and we can't come to God without coming through the earth. We've received Holy Communion, which is the body and blood of Christ. So I just, before I did any details, I started with that geometry. So it's an example of something that's new but old at the same time. So often the limitations of tradition or the limitations of our liturgical need actually compel you to do things you wouldn't have done otherwise. So the icon tradition, because it was trying to lead people through it to the saint or the holy feast, devised all sorts of means to do this. So way before this sort of multi-view perspective of Picasso, it was being done already. Like this building here is viewed from the front and from the side at the same time. They combine 2 different perspectives. What do you notice about the sides of the base here? Where, if you continue that line with that line, where would they converge? Yeah, in front, in you. And you'll find that in a lot of modern art. So it's already there in the icon. So the liturgical demands of the icon forced it to do things that were actually really creative. They didn't just sort of dream it up for fun. So the limitations always force you upwards and downwards. Someone said to me that a river without banks destroys, it floods. So holy tradition offers limits to direct. I was commissioned by the king to design this screen here, which was possessed and covered him while he was being anointed. That's the high point of the service. The anointing is what makes him spiritually a king. So that had all sorts of limitations. You know, it had to be cloth, had to be light enough at a very short time to make it. So we had to combine all handwork with some machine embroidery and all sorts of things. So with the physical demands, it compelled us to do things we wouldn't have normally done, but hopefully to good effect. Another false concept is art is all about self-expression. I want to express myself. That's a very modern idea. The word art is interesting. It comes in the term to fitly join together, like articulated truck. It's 2 parts joined together. An articulate person joins words together. Even more profoundly, it derives from the Proto-Indo-European word arti, meaning beauty, moral correctness, and first original things. So originally art meant going to the origin of things, combined with goodness of heart. You couldn't do a great artwork unless you knew the divine. So I've been going for almost an hour, so I'll slow down first. I'll stop soon. So one way to think of this transition through Western art history is 3 to 2 to 1. So most traditional art of different cultures is to do with 3, the heavenly subject, the mediating image, and the venerating viewer. So this is the church I go to. So we have this icon screen, which both veils the altar, but also reveals it. That these are the worshippers, and then through the ritual, through a good life, etc., you're going up to heaven. So always three. And then I would say, starting from the Renaissance, man became the measure of all things. Art is more the genius of the individual artist and depicting the physical world as accurately as possible. So you go from 3 to 2. So it's not so much the art mediating to a higher world, it's just the art reflecting what we see around us anyway. I might be simplifying, but that's the tendency. And then we get to 20th century, and it's just the one. It's just you're looking at the artist's ego or the artist's angst or whatever the artist is into. So there's a gradual decay, I would say. And there's good in all this, and the dangers in all these. So I'm oversimplifying, but you can see what I'm getting at. Religion limits art and reduces creativity, very common thought. But in reality, because there's a certain narrowness, it actually opens up freedoms vertically. What's more infinite than God himself and the mysteries of the world aflame with the divine logos? So in fact, it inspires you. In fact, a lot of great secular artists were actually profoundly inspired by religious inspiration. So let's read this from Vincent van Gogh, writing to his brother Theo. Batani, if you do read that.
Would fade men and women for the touch of the eternal, is symbol was once the halo, which we try to convey by the very radiance and vibrancy of our covering.
That's it. And as you probably know, Vincent van Gogh trained as a preacher, as a missionary. So very much sort of thinking like a Christian. So his intense colours were just his way of expressing what the halo used to express. Brancusi, look at things until you really see them. This, like the big eyes, until you see the fire. Keep looking at the bush until you see the fire. Those who sit close to God have already done so. He did many variations on this all the time, trying to get closer and closer to the real bird in space, to the fire within the bird, as it were. So in other words, a lot of this art that our secular art historians to say it's great art, they don't realise actually there is a religious inspiration behind it. How there's other people, this is a quote, of course, from John Paul Sartre's play. This whole idea of great art is defined by how different it is. In other words, other stuff is, I've got to push away and I've got to be completely different from them. The icon tradition says, no, we're fulfilled in relationship. I just love Giacometti. One reason I like him is that he seems to distill, but with compassion, unlike Francis Bacon, the loneliness of the modern man. So these people are sort of in the same square, if you like, but they're walking in different directions. They're not relating. Here, this is the chapel that I frescoed at the Hermitage where I lived. This is completely frescoed all around. So this is sort of a communion. Communion between the saints, and they communing with us. They're looking out at us. So liturgical art thrives because of relationship. I'll stop there, but just finish. There's not more here, but I won't bore you with it. It says in Genesis, let us make man in our image. Who do you think was speaking then? Let us make man in our image. Obviously God is speaking, but... Exactly. So, if we're made in the image of the Holy Trinity, what does it tell us about what it is to be truly human? In relationship, exactly. How do you enter the church? Do you baptize yourself? Someone else baptizes you. The whole church is baptizing you. You're entering into the communion of the saints, into the communion of all those who've gone before. So that's why baptism is sort of restoring the image of man, because we're restoring our relationship. So I think that's the major role of our one way or the other, to restore unity, not just between us and God, us and ourselves, us and our fellow human being, us and the wonderful world that God has given to us. I paint with, this is fresco, real fresco on lime. Most of these other things I made here are made from wood that's been chucked out, basically. So I took stuff that had been rejected and tried to make it more articulate in the praise of God. So I'm re-establishing a godly relationship, not just with hopefully other people, but also with the immaterial world. So art should be articulate, should join back together everything in the praise of God.